This meeting is being recorded.
Good. Welcome everyone to Contemporary Issues class. We are glad to have you here today, and we are so glad to have Rev Jerry Butler with us, our pastor of education and formation, a new revision of his title recently. So thank you so much, Jerry, for coming to talk to us about Methodism today. A relevant topic for us, of course. So welcome everybody, and would somebody go ahead and shut the door if anybody's near us back there? We'll try and keep any noise back there down. And welcome Zoomers, nice to have you, Joe and Susan, and everybody that's on today. We are still experimenting with our new video system in the room here, and we think we have the bugs worked out, but please be patient with us today. Including with the microphone, I can hear myself a little breathy on this, so we are still working on this. And also, folks, the microphone system here picks up side conversations very easily, so the Zoomers can hear us, so please be aware of that. Our usual announcements, Zoomers, please mute yourself on the lower left corner of your screen when you're not speaking, and we are recording this for future playback. And please do jump in with questions and comments for Jerry today. We'd love to have a discussion too. It's nice for me to be back. I missed seeing you all the last 2 weeks. I was on a little cruise from Eastern Canada around to Maine and Boston, and it was a lot of fun. My first cruise on a big boat, a Princess boat, and so I'd never done that before. It was nice, except there was no fall colors at all. In Canada, New England, they said we've had no rain, and so it's either green or brown colors. If you want to see reds and yellows, go to Colorado. So I said, okay, go back home to Colorado and see the colors. But besides that, it was fun. If anybody else has been traveling any place or going anywhere, where are you going with? Germany. Good. The Passion Play that they have every 10 years there. Oh, I bet that was.
It was delayed for 2 years because of COVID. They're going to get back on schedule on 11:30. I didn't want to take my chances.
Yeah. Zoomers, can you hear Linda when she was talking now? Does our microphone pick it up?
Yeah, it was pretty soft, but I could hear it.
Okay, we'll ask our class attendees to speak up so the Zoomers can hear too. Very good. Okay, anything else? We have a Christmas party, class Christmas party coming up December 5, Monday, December 5. So I'll send out email about that. It's going to be here in the church by the kitchen. And we're going to have food and trivia games and Christmas things. And so if you want to get in the Christmas mood, hope you'll come and join us then. So I will send out that notice. Okay, with that, Rev Jerry is our expert in all things historical church. And why do you love historical things so much?
Oh, I kind of fell in love with early church history because, well, there's 2 reasons. When you look at the first 500-600 years of Christianity, more specifically the first 400 years, 500 years, is one of the aspects of the church that I'll show you in a minute, is that it's really one of those moments in history where the church was truly one. There was one church on the planet. And that, kind of, it's just interesting. The other part is, especially for the first 300 years, they're a lot like us. They were trying to figure this thing out. There were ideas floating around. What's interesting is that even triune language, the language of the Trinity existed as early as like 160 in some of the early letters of Ignatius. But beyond that, they really didn't understand what this Christianity thing meant. And they really didn't understand what they meant by saying things like Jesus was divine and human. They didn't know how to articulate that. And so they were kind of figuring it out as they went.
And we're still figuring it out.
Yeah, and we're still figuring it out to a great degree, but I think what's great about it is that, a lot, the Ecclesiastes, the old preacher was right? There's nothing new under the sun, and what I like to tell people is that we can't discount the early church or the gifts of the medieval church as much as we would like to demonize those people, because we wouldn't know what to think without them. We wouldn't have a vocabulary without them. We wouldn't know how to worship without them. Because everything that we do in that sanctuary, or any sanctuary that you walk into, is in some form or fashion an iteration of what has been done before, right? And so everything builds upon everything else in the religious world. And so because of that, that's kind of why I'm attracted to it. I am particularly attracted to Orthodox expressions. I love the Catholic Church. At one point, I thought about becoming a Catholic very seriously, but there were just some things that held me back from doing that. But I truly love Eastern expressions of Christianity. So, any brand of vodka that's Orthodox, right? Eastern Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Armenian, I don't care. They're just all super lovely to me, and I can tell you why for a million reasons that I won't. So anyway, yeah, that's why I love church history.
Thank you.
I do.
That's good to know. Okay, your microphone is not on.
Oh,
It's
okay.
on.
Well, let me wear
It's
that one.
on white.
I want to wear this one.
I want you to hold it. It's much better than
Oh, okay.
so when you hear yourself echo,
Yeah,
it's good.
that's great. And I talk really loud anyway because I can't hear. So what we're gonna do today is I'm gonna try to condense about, I don't know, 200 or 300 years of history into an hour. And like I mentioned in a little preamble that I sent to y'all, one of the reasons why I love studying about the church and knowing where I come from is because I think that the soil is important, right? I think that the ground that we till and that we cultivate in our lives, especially in our religious lives, is important because it kind of demands our attention in the sense that all of the stuff that is in the soil is what we grow from. And so to understand where we came from, to understand who we are, I think is a valuable exercise for any Christian on any level of thought, right? And especially for Methodists, because what I'm going to show you in a little bit is Methodism is weird. It really is. Methodism is weird among all the mainline Protestant denominations, right? And I don't even like to call it Protestant because Methodism really started as a movement. It didn't start as a religion, right? Even through the Reformation, right? That's why England had so much trouble trying to figure this thing out, because it was a movement from the Anglican Church. It was something that John and Charles started to try to revive the Church of England. And a movement is decidedly different in character and in form and function than a religion, right? So one of the tensions, even today in the 21st century, is what do Methodists mean by church? Capital C. If somebody had to ask you to define what is the capital C church, some of you would probably say, well, the church is out there. You hear that all the time, right? The church is not a building, right? It's not sanctuary worship, it's out there. It's mission oriented, right? I would say, no, I want to challenge that a little bit, right? I think the church is sacramental. I think the church exists inside the sanctity of the sacraments, baptism and the Lord's Supper. That's the church for me, right? But it's both in a way, right? And because we started off as a movement, we tend to kind of have schizophrenia when it comes to this. And that's why we have like all these different brands of stuff, even within our own denomination, right? Because we're still, I think, trying to figure out what the church is. Now, I can guarantee you, if you ask an Orthodox priest what the church is, no problem. They will regurgitate line by line. The church is, I believe the church is one holy, apostolic, universal church. That's right from the creed, right? And then they'll talk about what one means and what holy means and what apostolic means. They'll flesh it out in those four categories, right? So anyway, that's got nothing to do with anything. Let's start with a prayer. This is, anytime I do anything that's Wesley related, I like to start with this because I love Susanna Wesley. If you want to learn more about Methodism, I would encourage you to read the sermons of John and Charles, but I would really encourage you to pick up a really good biography of Susanna because she was an amazing woman. So this is a little prayer that they found from her that is in our United Methodist Book of Worship. So I'll pray these words for us again. You, O Lord, have called us to watch and pray. Therefore, whatever may be the sin against which we pray, make us careful to watch against it, and so have reason to expect that our prayers will be answered. In order to perform this duty aright, grant us grace to preserve a sober, equal temper, and sincerity to pray for your assistance. You can go to the next slide. Steve.
I did.
Oh, you did. Okay. So what the next slide is going to show you is I kind of like to start off with backwards.
There, all right.
There you go. Yeah.
Just to check also, Zoomers, can you hear Jerry okay?
Yes,
Okay.
Good, thank you.
Thought about something funny my wife said to me the other day about hearing me, because that's not hard to get that scream on. Anyway, I love my wife. Let's not get the wrong idea. So anyway, this is kind of, I like to show this because this is kind of a grid, if you will, a good flow chart to kind of show you how the basic denominations of Christianity have spilled out over the centuries. Like I said, for the first probably, I would say 800 years of the church, there was really only one church. Now, there were some divisions after Constantine. Constantine moved the capital of the church down from the west to the east. It was a little town called Constantinople. And when he did that, he created some problems. It was really when he started that move and made that move that the church kind of started to separate into east and west. The east spoke Greek and were very Hellenistic in nature. The west spoke Latin and were very Roman in nature. And before we get a bad idea of the Roman church, it's important to remember that for the first like 500 years of the church's history, in order to be valid and legitimate as a local body, you really needed to be in communion with the Church of Rome. And if you weren't, you were seen as apostate, right? In a lot of ways, right? And we could go into a lot about how that happened. So Rome is not so bad, right? After Constantine, Rome took a major shift. Now, around the beginning of the 9th century, in the 1000s, we all heard about this little argument that the Easterns and the Westerns had, right? And it was over something that happened in the Creed. The Western Church inserted a little phrase, it's called the Philautoque, into the Nicene Constantinople Creed. And they did so without asking anybody in the East. And the patriarch said, you can't do that. And they got a little ticked off. And that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. There was a lot that went on before that. There was a lot of political and other stuff going on, but that was it. And the Eastern Patriarch said, I excommunicate you. And the Western Patriarch said, no, I excommunicate you. And there they went. And so that's how you get this branch of Catholicism in the Roman Western world. And then even today, you get branches of the Orthodox Church in the Eastern world. From that kind of lineage, right, the Orthodox Church, I have to tell you, has remained pretty steady. Right. And so there's this lovely joke that is growing up Baptist. I like to say we're a Baptist knocks on the door of an Orthodox, and the Orthodox lady answers the door, and the guy at the door witnesses to her and says, Have you found Jesus, ma'am, your Lord and Savior? And the little Orthodox lady goes, we never lost him. That's kind of what they think, right? Well, I mean, what an Orthodox person thinks, right, is that their denomination was established in 33 AD, right? Like that's where they trace their lineage back. So they are one church, right? From Catholicism, we get some other stuff going on. Of course, I'm not going to go through all of this, but the Church of England, known as Anglicanism, was basically the result of a little argument that Henry VIII had, that he wanted to get a divorce. They didn't want him to get a divorce. And he said, well, I'll just start my own church then, and I'll be the head of it. And that's what he did. And so he started his own church, and that's what the Church of England is. And then there was a lot of things that went on through the 16th and 17th centuries. There was a lot of turmoil, especially through the 14th and 15th centuries and into the 16th century. And basically what Anglicanism kind of came to be was this kind of church in the middle. It was this kind of very middle ground between the Catholics and between the Protestants. And it was influenced throughout the centuries on both sides. Like some years it was very Catholic and very Roman in nature, and some years it was very Calvinist in nature. And it's always kind of been that way. Well, from that soil, right, you get two guys, John and Charles Wesley, who I'll show you in a minute. And they create this movement that later becomes a denomination, but we stem directly from the Anglican Church. And John and Charles and his father before him were devout Anglican priests right up until the day they died. John never, ever, ever denounced his Anglican priesthood. He had to kind of do some things when he got married, because that was a no-no at Oxford. But he was still an Anglican priest, as was his brother. And then from Methodism, you get an offshoot of what we know as the Pentecostal movement. The Pentecostals, you can think of Assembly of God, Church of God, those kind of Pentecostal branches of the church. Those started to appear from Methodist roots in the early 20th century. And then, of course, from the Reformation, you get Lutherans, you get Presbyterians. Lutherans are, of course, German, and of that ilk, the Presbyterians are French, following Calvin. And then, interestingly enough, the Anabaptists that we'll see in a minute, those are actually things that stemmed out of the Anglican Church. The Anabaptists were a movement of a particular branch of people. And from the Anabaptists, you get what we know as Baptists today. Okay, you can go to the next one. So the Methodist Church in general, the United Methodist Church, like I say, has its roots in the Church of England. That became separate from the Catholic Church in the 1500s. The Anglican Church expressed Protestant beliefs in its articles of religion, what was known as homilies. Homilies, if you come from a very high church tradition like Episcopalian or whatever, homilies are what are known as formally endorsed sermons, right? And so a priest will write a sermon, the church will endorse it, and it'll get cataloged. And then at that point, anybody can use it probably. They just have to give credit to the guy, right? But that's what homilies are. They're a little bitty short, like 10-minute snippets from the priest. Its forms of worship were given in the Book of Common Prayer, which is still widely used today. Its leaders were Charles and John Wesley. Charles being a little bit older, I think he was the older brother. And then, no, John was a little bit older, and then Charles was a little bit younger. John and Charles were two of 17 children to Samuel and Susanna. So if you don't respect Susanna yet, you should know. And actually, she bore two other children that died in childbirth. And so she actually bore 19. So get your calculators out and do 19 times 9. Yeah, and then divide that by 12, and you'll see how many years of her life she spent pregnant. So wow. Samuel was, his father was highly educated, a priest of the Church of England. He wrote poetry, he wrote theological works. He actually spent the majority of John and Charles's life writing a Latin commentary on the book of Job. Susanna was also incredibly and remarkably educated for her time. She wrote a commentary on the Apostles' Creed, and she wrote several other pious works that are out there. Her methodical piety and her individual care, this combination of collective and individual care for her family, deeply influenced all of the children, but more especially John and Charles. John and Charles lived with their family in a little village called Epsworth, which I think some of you had mentioned in Lincolnshire. Epsworth, you can still go there today and see the house. You go to the next one. So what was the world like at the open of the 18th century? If you went church shopping, what were you likely to see? Well, this little continuum gives you kind of a view of what the world looked like in the early 18th century. So this is decades before, right when the John and Charles were born, right? And it goes from most radical to the more traditional. And the more traditional are going to be people that are more loyal to the crown. The moderates are going to be the most loyal to the crown and the Church of England. And then you're going to start veering off to a little bit more traditional. So the Latitudinarians are known as the Latitude Men. This was a group of the 17th century English theologians. It was comprised of clerics and academics from the University of Cambridge who were moderate Anglicans. So they were members of the Church of England and loyalists to the crown. In particular, they believed to adhering to very specific doctrines, liturgical practices, and church organizational forms, as did the Puritans, by the way. And that wasn't necessarily harmful, right? There's a good quote that says, the sense that one had special instruction from God made individuals less amenable to moderation and compromise are to reason itself. And so they were very centered, right? They're commonly referred to as the broad church, right? So they're very concerned with doctrine, very concerned with liturgical practice, but they're also kind of broad enough to avoid any kind of individualistic jaunts. The Caroline Divines were another group in this form of moderates. Again, they had a common commitment to the Book of Common Prayer. They wrote several things. They thought that the Via Media from Queen Elizabeth I, or the middle way that the church lived by, was a positive position. They said it witnessed to the universality of God and God's kingdom, working through, I love this, the fallible earthly ecclesia anglicana, or the earthly Anglican church, right? And they had a high regard for scripture. They looked to it on all matters concerning salvation. And like I said, they were kind of right in the middle. Another couple of groups that are kind of weird for people to see are these non-juring people, the non-jurors. Okay, so that comes from Latin. Jura means in Latin to swear an oath. And so a non-juror is someone who refuses to swear an oath. And so there was this little kind of spat at the deposition and exile of James II and James VII. It was known as the Glorious Revolution of England, right? And when it kind of all got back together, the ruling monarch put down a decree that all of the clergy had to swear an oath of loyalty to the crown. And so those that did not do that were called non-jurors. And then the most radical of them were called dissenters, basically. Interestingly enough, John's grandfather was a dissenter. Samuel was a loyalist. So how about that for Thanksgiving dinner, right? Yeah, they're going back and forth. And Samuel faced a lot of slack from his congregation about his stance with the crown and his loyalty to the Anglican Church. He got a lot of hate mail for that. And I'll show you in a minute. They actually tried to burn his house down, his own congregants. So I want to tell Mark, while you're getting hate email, this cat had his house burned down. So it's, whatever. Deal with it. I'm just kidding.
I don't want this on the recording.
Anyway, so the English dissenters, English separatists, again, these were people that moved to live in force. Dissenters opposed any sort of state interference with religious matters. This is the group of people that we know that kind of migrated over the colonies, right? These are the hardcore Puritans that just did not want to be influenced by the crown and religious matters, and so they fled that environment and they moved across the ocean over the seas. You can go to the next one. So, like I said, they tried to burn his house down. There's a picture of Epsworth. That's today, actually. You can go there and see the house. And there's a little lithograph of the Great Fire. And we know quite a bit about the Epworth Rectory fire from the letters of Samuel and Susanna that they wrote to family and friends in early 1709. Wesley's 11-year-old daughter, Hetty, was awakened by the sound of sleep. And around 11:30, they say, there were burning pieces of the roof that were landing on her bed. And she ran to find her father. Dad was sleeping in an extra room because his wife was ill at the time and probably uncomfortable, as she, again, was in her third trimester of pregnancy again. He remembers hearing someone yell fire. He didn't know if his house was really on fire, if it was someone else. He got up to investigate. He goes out into the hallway. The burning roof is coming down. And Susanna later wrote to her son Samuel, who was away at boarding school, that nothing but a thin wall kept the fire from the staircase. And so it was a pretty harrowing event. They did manage, after a lot of gyrations, to get everybody out, except for one poor little guy. Or Jackie is what they called him. Isn't that cute? That was John's nickname. They called him Jackie. So Jackie was stuck. He couldn't get out. And his father tried to get into the house several times. He says he was defeated by the flames and he was kicked back out of the house. And John didn't know really what to do, but kind of the story, the legend goes that as the family was praying outside together for John and our little Jackie, that a window became open to John and he literally climbed out the window, and somebody had put a ladder up there and they went up and pulled him literally from the flames, right? And so there's this great verse, I'll let you look it up. It's in Zechariah 3:2. And this was the verse that Susanna constantly referred to John as, because she plucked him from the flames of death, right? To be a prophet. Yeah, so pretty harrowing time. So, I mean, imagine that as a formational time. But also there's other things, right? So go to the next one. Good.
Yeah, quick question. Do we know any more specifically about why or who burned the house?
Yeah, it was his congregants. His congregants were mad over his declarations of loyalty to the crown, and they did not like that. They thought he was just a little too complicit with the crown, and so they took matters into their own. Yep. Welcome to 17th century or 18th century. Yeah. Yeah. No, let's not get any ideas.
Can you tell this congregation just to go to another church then?
Do what now?
Would it really call them to go to another church?
No, because that's not how it worked. No, really, it didn't. And this is one thing I kind of, Catholics, huh?
With friends like these who need.
There's enemies, right? Yeah, and you have to remember, like this is, like I said, this is early 18th century England, right? And the church world is a little different. It's kind of like Catholics nowadays. So most of my Catholic friends tell me, and all my Orthodox friends tell me, is that when you move into a city, even today, you don't go church shopping if you're a Catholic. The first question that you ask is, where's the parish church? Because there's usually one around or close to you, right? And that's the one you start with. Now, Catholics are a little bit more liberal these days. And if they get a little bent with the priest for one reason or another, they'll just go find another Catholic church, even if they got to drive a little ways. But not in this time, right? And this time, these villages were very centered. They were very rural in many cases, like they were kind of pockets of villages separated by vast areas of farmland. And so that was really the only choice they had, right? And so if you didn't like your church, just burn the preacher's house down. I guess. Yeah, that's when it was over. I mean, it gives you a sense of the kind of turmoil that was in the country, right, at the time, right? Everybody likes to think of good old England as this happy place, but it really wasn't. There was a lot of unrest at this time. And some of it we can blame on Henry, and some of it we can blame on, I would think, even the Reformation and the cultural influences of Europe at that time. Remember, the Reformation, we always like to romanticize the Reformation and say, oh, we're in a new period of Reformation. And I always raise my hand and say, yeah, but what about that pesky 30 Years' War? Right? Because that's what the Reformation created. The Reformation created the 30 Years' War. And there were more Christians killed by Christians than in any other war this planet has seen since and beyond that. Right? It was a nasty, nasty time. So these religious differences were important, right? They mattered to people, and people bloodied each other over them, right? And this is the world. This is the world pre-enlightenment, right? That John moves into, and that he's influenced by. He's influenced deeply by this. Other things influence him, right? He had strict tutelage for the first 5 years of his life under his mother at Epworth. The Charterhouse School, as I'll show you in a minute, he spent 6 years there as a young lad. And then at a very, very tender age, before he was even 20, he moved to Oxford and went to Christ College. And he spent 5 or 6 years there, right? And I think he graduated Oxford, he was like 23, 24, very young, right? When he graduated, just highly, highly educated. So let's look at some of the discipline. I always like to show people this. What was Susanna really like? Go to the next. Imagine this for your grandkids or your kids, right? The family met for morning prayer before 6 a.m., which was followed by a time of individual prayer and then breakfast. In the morning, they were directed to read Psalms and a chapter of the Old Testament, after which they went to their private prayers before they got their breakfast or came into the family, right? After the fire of 1709, Psalms were sung at the beginning and end of the school period for the children. When the house was rebuilt and the children all brought home, we entered upon strict reform, he writes. This is John writing this. And then was begun the custom of singing psalms and beginning and leaving school morning and evening. At 5 p.m., the children retired, which basically meant the parents sent them away. Go to your room. From the family, they went to be by themselves. A general retirement at 5 o'clock was entered upon when the oldest took the youngest that could speak, and the second, the next, to whom they read the Psalms for the day and a chapter of the New Testament. So this is what they did. The kids all go off, they pair out, the oldest teaches the youngest, and they sit and read the Psalms and the New Testament together in their rooms. You can go to the next one. Susanna's rules, the children of this family were taught as soon as they could speak the Lord's Prayer. So no, they did not say mine. The first words out of their mouth were, Our Father, who art in heaven, which they were made to say at rising and at bedtime constantly. I like that he puts that in there, like it was constantly, to which they grew bigger and added a short prayer for their parents and some collects, which you can find in the Book of Common Prayer, a short catechism, which they probably also got from the Common Prayer, and some portion of scripture that their memories could bear. So what you're seeing here is from a very young age, they were made to memorize the Lord's Prayer, to speak it at least twice a day. They were to memorize a shorter prayer and some collects from the Book of Common Prayer. And then they were made to memorize a small catechism and some portion of scripture they could bear. And they were to memorize and recite these things throughout the day, very consistently. They were made very early to distinguish the Sabbath from other days before they could well speak or go, like even when they're babies. They were soon taught to be still at family prayers. Oh my goodness. And to ask the blessing immediately after, which they used to do by sign before they could kneel or speak. If they wanted a blessing, they would sign something for their mother. But this is a very reserved form of prayer, right? I mean, it's funny because my grandma used to detest clapping at service. Oh boy, if I wanted to get in trouble, if I wanted to get in trouble, all I had to do was clap at a worship service, and that was going to be a bad day. Because that's the Lord's gift, not yours, not his or hers, whatever, so anyway, let's move on. Next slide. So
is that where the Catholics and the signing of the cross maybe started?
well, I think it probably started before that. I think whatever the rituals of the Catholic Church were, the Anglicans picked that up.
Oh.
Yeah. And Anglican church is very high churchy. You know what I mean? It looks and feels a lot like a Catholic worship service. It's just the structure of the Catholic Church. And instead of a Roman Missal, they have the Book of Common Prayer. And like I said, the hierarchy within the Anglican Church is a little different. It's not as rigid as the Catholic Church. Yeah. So this is the other, I like to show this slide because I think this is probably the most formational period of John's life. He moves into this place when he's just a young lad, think like 10 years old. And he moves into this charter house hospital and school. It was a former Carthusian monastery that was reconstituted in the Reformation age where scholars or students lived in monastic cells. They ate in their refectory, and they just kind of played games in the little cloister or the little courtyard. The community is a community that rose earlier. Younger boys served older boys, so John was probably very used to this. They said daily prayers, they said the Lord's Supper according to the Book of Common Prayer rituals. So this whole life, you see, was something that he was very, very used to. Now, this is the formational part. As a community, though, it was also constituted of elderly men who were most likely retired Anglican priests, most of them were. And they found themselves without any means to support themselves after they retired. So they were vacant. And so this place would take them in. And it was basically a retirement home for older men. And what is interesting is that the boys would take care of these elderly men. That was part of their job. And so think about that for a minute. From a very young age, John was taught to do stuff. He was rooted in the sacraments and the liturgies and the prayers of his church and the doctrines of his church. But at the same time, he was doing stuff. He was caring for people. And he was probably making these connections at a very, very young age, right? That this is more than just ritual, right? Anyway, that's my opinion. Don't look on it. So you click over. This is Charterhouse. Oops, went too far. That's Oxford. One more, go a couple more. That's Oxford. That's Christ College. One more. There you go. That's Charterhouse. So they're very proud of their former students. So if you click one more on the side of the building, if you go there today, you see this little plaque. Let's say they're very proud of their scholar from Charterhouse, which just meant he was an elementary school student. They put a little quote there, and then there's a little plaque on the side of the building that kind of talks about the history of the house itself. So after this, like I said, the next step was Oxford. And John and Charles, you click one more. So John and Charles Wesley later attended, they attended residential schools, and then they went on to Oxford. They were both ordained during their time in Oxford as Anglican priests. They participated in various religious societies designed for the cultivation of holiness, or what they called Christian holiness. And they also did active service for the poor and people in prison. And soon this little society they formed were called the Methodists for their methodical piety, right? They were very disciplined. As students at Christ Church, believe me, nobody calls it Christ College, call it Christ Church at Oxford. John Wesley longed for a group to which he could share his spiritual growth, so he kind of wanted a small group. He wanted this, right? And so when his brother Charles arrived, John, I think you read his journals, I think he hoped that Charles would get in on this gig with him, but Charles didn't. He was a good college student, and he acted like a college student. And even though they had this routine of spiritual accountability at an early age, unfortunately, Charles got into college routines, and he kind of put his growth on hold. It was at this time that John got really, really into his studies. And he went to a smaller college at Oxford. It's called Lincoln College. And that's where he was made a fellow. And Wesley was guaranteed a room as a fellow at Lincoln College. He was given free meals, he was given students to teach, and he was given an annual stipend for his life expenses as long as he remained unmarried. Right, and that's still a rule today. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little confusing in the sense that within Oxford, you have other schools.
Yeah,
Is that it?
you do. Yeah, there's
So
several.
you have the overall
Yeah.
school.
That's exactly right.
And I was not aware that Oxford was that obedient to the crown.
Yeah, it really was. I
was
mean, it's an
over-
institution of England, right? And see, that's what I mean, like, at this time, you have to remember, like, this is one thing, like, as Americans, we don't get, right? And by the way, I'm infatuated with British women, so I like everything. I cried when Elizabeth died, just so you know.
Yeah.
I was at a restaurant and I cheered up at the window. But anyway, this is one thing we don't get, right? Is that you have to understand, like, to be English is to be Anglican.
Anglican?
Right? Anglican is to be a member of the Church of England. In the same way as to be German is to be a Lutheran. You know what I mean? So the national identity of ethos is really, really tied to the crown and to the Church of England. And so everything in England, right, especially educational institutions, right, are always going to be tied to the church, and the church is going to be tied to the nation, right, because it's part of their identity. And you know, this is a lot of what people don't understand about Russia as well. You know, during the evolution of the Rus or the Russians, right, after the Ottoman Empire destroys the Roman Empire and there's no one church anymore, what you start seeing in the Orthodox Church are these ethnically divided communities, right? So you get the Russian Orthodox Church and the Greek Orthodox Church and this and that, right? And so when you go to that church, to be Russian is to be Orthodox, right? You're almost not considered Russian if you're not baptized in the Russian Orthodox Church, right? Because they're that tightly linked together in their minds as far as identity. So that's what that's like. So yes, long-winded answer to your question. So today, if you go to the next one, at Lincoln College, like I said, they're very proud of their fellow. So they got him on the glass window there, even though they kicked him out after he got married. There's some words there, John Wesley Fellow, 1726 to 51. At the request of his father, after he led this time, he was called back to St. Andrew Church in Epsworth to their home. So he went to serve under his father as an associate pastor, for the best language we use, or as a curate. One day he received a letter from Charles from Oxford saying, this is what Charles wrote: "I awoke out of my lethargy," his younger brother wrote, and he desired to renew his spiritual growth, right? So John probably went, "I told you so." And he received the letter, he traveled to Oxford to visit his brother, and within a few weeks after his arrival back in Epsworth, Lincoln College asked him to return to be a resident at Lincoln College. And so reunited with Charles and his renewed vigor, this guy named William Morgan, that's when they really started to create what a lot of you have probably heard as these Methodist societies at Oxford, right? That's when it really began. And they formed these studies, they form what's called the Holy Club. They grow out of a deep love for God and service to others, and they become kind of the centerpiece of Wesley's life today. So now here comes the fun stuff. So go to the next one. So believe it or not, Wesley, John did come to America, and it was a total disaster. Total disaster. John and Charles served the new founded colony of Georgia down south from 1736 to 1738. John was sent as a missionary from the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. And you know, everybody had a society back then. So they funded his journey and sent him over here to spread the very word of Jesus. And during that time in Georgia, Charles came over here as the personal secretary of one General James Oglethorpe, who was kind of the head guy in charge of this new Georgian colony. Along the way, they meet some Moravians and Lutheran Christians who emphasized this heartfelt repentance, and it was very charismatic and Pentecostal. And they also learned about the Moravians' practice of organizing believers into smaller societies, into kind of smaller groups, if you will. And so searching for his own kind of religious experience, what he found was this complicated romantic experience. He fell in love with Sophia Hupke. She was the niece of Savannah's chief magistrate. His name was Thomas Costin. Wesley met Hopkey on a 4-month-long sail to Georgia from England, and while traveling on the ship, Sophia's mother employed Wesley to teach her daughter French, because he knew French. After arriving in Savannah, their passion grew. Sophia was confident that Wesley's intentions were honorable and would, of course, lead to marriage. Put a ring on that finger. Wesley sought the advice of the Moravian bishop, though, who he had come to admire. And he advised the young lover to avoid contact with female admirers. And Wesley took his mentor's admonishment without any explanation. He went to Sophie, and he abruptly cut it off. Stopped seeing her. Soon she met someone else. And of course, that caused Wesley great pain and jealousy. And he began lashing out at her in public, rebuking her of her sins. Yeah, he got mad. He got really jealous, right? So that's what I find funny, right? If we have this like romantic view of Wesley, he was like 20-something. He was an idiot, you know what I mean? And he fell in love with this girl on a boat. And then, she thinks he was going to marry me. It's really wonderful. And he gets over here, and the Moravian guy says, no. And so he goes, can't see anymore, walks out the door. She goes and finds somebody else, as she should have, and he gets mad about it. That was John Wesley. Yeah, that's John Wesley. And so in March 1737, she marries William Williamson, a clerk in her uncle's store. Remember, he's the chief magistrate. The couple ran away to South Carolina. They were married, which is about 22 miles up the river, away from the scathing admonishments of Wesley. Her new husband took Wesley to court for his attacks on his new bride, and local gossip spread about. And after the marriage, Wesley seemed inconsolable and vindictive. This all came to a head when he exacerbated the situation. And August 7th of 1737, write that one down in your memory, he refused to give Miss Sophia Hopkey Williamson the sacrament of Holy Communion. Turned her away. Yep, he would not do it. The following day, a warrant was issued against Wesley by Williamson and his bride Sophia. The complaint was for defaming Sophia by refusing to administer the sacrament in a public congregation without due cause. And that's really important because look, this was also a different time. Within the Church of England and even within the Catholic Church, priests, I know we don't like this, but priests are within their rights to refuse communion. Okay, they can do that. Now it's very frowned upon to do that because it causes a PR nightmare for one. But it's also just kind of bad form, right, to refuse it. But look, if you grew up Catholic and you created a mortal sin and you were excommunicated, you're not getting the sacrament, right? And if you weren't baptized as Catholic, you're not getting the sacrament. It's the same thing in the Orthodox Church. You're not going to get it. And so he had his power to do this, but he did it out of ridiculous. Williamson sued him for like £1,000 Of course, he didn't have this money. And so in 1737, the trial began. The jury was secured by Costin. Remember him, the magistrate, her daddy, her uncle, or whatever. And Wesley was never able to establish good relations with the people of Savannah. I can't imagine why.
Yeah.
Because these settlers in Georgia, they were a mixed bag. They were Anglicans, they were dissenters, they were Scotsmen, they were French Huguenots who were basically Presbyterians who were kicked out of France. Some were Italian Jews, Spanish Jews, French Jews, Swiss-speaking people, all kinds of people. And so he laments over this, and he writes in his journal on December 2nd of 1737 that about 8 o'clock, the tide then serving, I shook the dust off my feet and left Georgia after having preached the gospel there, not as I ought to, but as I was able. Whatever. He couldn't stay there anymore. And so there's a little plaque. If you go to Georgia today, this little plaque actually is in Savannah. You can go check it to the next one. There's a little plaque there commemorating the Moravians right there. And they quote John Wesley. This marker is here an appreciation of the physical and spiritual nurture given by the Moravians to John Wesley upon his arrival. And so it's like only the Moravians liked him. Everybody else hated him. So that's why I think this plaque is both nice and ironic. But anyway, there you go. So he goes back to England. I'm going to plow through this really, really quick. He goes back to England. He has his kind of what we know as the Aldersgate moment. Do y'all know what this is? Most good Methodists know what this is. So actually, Charles had it first. Charles wrote to his brother and told him about this spiritual experience that he had during Pentecost in May. And then 3 days later, while at Aldersgate, John has the same kind of spiritual moment where he believes that once and for all that this is real, that his sins are forgiven. And it's very, very transitional for him. And this is really when his life changes and starts moving around. So they do a bunch of stuff. I'm going to kind of blast through all. I'm going to cut them right out. But basically, here, just blast through the slides. I'll try to talk to it. So that's a hymn. Go to another one. That's one of Charles's hymn. So in 1743, they kind of start structuring these societies. They have what are known as classes, bands, and societies. So I like to put it in contemporary terms. Think of Highlands Ranch as a society, right? So all the Methodists living in Highland Ranch form a society. And then within that, you have what are called bands or bands, right? And these bands are geographically located, and they're groups of about 12 to 15 people, both men and women, right? And basically what they do is they go through the general rules of the society, which we all know them, right? Do no harm, do all the good you can, and attend to the ordinances of the church. And John writes this little pamphlet. And when he says things like do no harm, they literally go around the room, the steward does, of your little group. And he says things like, Steve, when was the last time you took the Lord's name in vain? When was the last time you got drunk? Have you been fighting or quarreling, right? So for each of these three categories, they're called to account. And the steward is taking notes. Anybody could join a society or a class as long as they sought God and understood their own kind of depravity, if you will. They were called seekers. And so they go through this thing of kind of forming this stuff and then flip through. I'm going really fast, I'm sorry. Because I want to get to kind of in America. So yeah, there's the general rules of society. There's time, keep going. Okay, stop it. So then what happens is John begins to utilize lay preachers in England. These are not ordained people. In 1744, he calls a conference of these people to teach them one way to go and gives them some instruction, and then he sends them out. And most Methodist preaching is based on a sermon that he wrote called The Way of Salvation, and you've all heard these terms. They preach prevenient grace, justifying grace, sanctifying grace, but this is kind of where it all kind of starts to take shape. Now, what's interesting during this time is in 1757, Charles refuses to preach itinerant. He will not move from the church that he's assigned to. And there's two things you need to know about the Church of England. Number one, itinerancy does not exist. An Anglican priest is told where he goes, and that's where he goes, and that's where he stays. The second thing is there's a rule in the Anglican Church that preaching outdoors is forbidden. You cannot perform any of the sacraments or the instituted means of the church on any other ground except the ground that has been consecrated by the church. Period. End of story. And so Charles, is getting a little bit with his brother. He goes, you're kind of breaking the rules a little bit. And he did not like the idea of lay preachers. He thought that that was uncalled for. And he believed that these practices were contrary to English laws of the time and to the Articles of Religion of the Church of England. So from that point, John was more involved with conferences and circuit preachers, and Charles starts to go follow the classes and the bands and societies where he can kind of control things. But it was at this time that we kind of see the movement turning into something else. So let's really quick go to the Americans. I want to leave a little bit of time for questions. So what happens is, go back one more. So what happens is about this time, a couple years later, Strawbridge, Heck, Barbara Heck, the woman, and Philip Embry, they organized some societies in New York in 1759 and 1760s. And they all preached at these things as lay preachers. And then what happened was there was a stalwart figure, and I think one of the most unsung heroes in our faith. He's literally got 3 pages of notes that I won't tell you about. But he is absolutely my hero. So go to the next one. This cat, Francis Ashbury. Ashbury, I think, is probably the guy that is most responsible for the shape and form and practice of American Methodism, more so than anyone else. Francis arrived here as a young man of 26 years of age in 1771, and he stepped off that boat. And for 45 years, his devotion, his discipline, his unwavering piety, his way with people. Most people during his time knew Ashbury by face and didn't know the president's face. That's how prolific he was. Hundreds of thousands of miles this guy traveled on horseback. He traveled when he was at death's door. He writes in one of his journals, this 3-volume set I got in my office, that he didn't know. He said that he felt ill for several days. He says, my throat has been in much disorder, but despite all of that, right, he continued on and he would not stop, right? And he, like I said, he's probably one of the key figures. So I'm not going to go through my 3-page program for you to death, but read about Ashbury. I mean, a biography, I can, if you want, there's an excellent biography of Ashbury that I can recommend to you. And in addition to reading the biography, I would highly encourage you to read his journals. I mean, they're very fascinating. He was very prolific. He started writing in 1771 on the boat and just continued writing until he died. And it's fascinating because it gives you a picture of the time, right? Like the fabric that he worked under.
Are you saying this happened in the South?
Well, he landed in New York, is where he landed. Yeah, he didn't like it. He thought that preachers there were staying in one spot for too long and becoming a little bit too full of themselves. And he wrote about that. And one of the first things that he wanted to institute was this system of itinerancy. And under his direction and under Coke, they would not allow most preachers to stay in one place for like a year. Because he thought if they stayed in one place for too long and they didn't itinerate very quickly, right, that they would turn into rock stars and they'd get puffed up and prideful. And so his idea was to keep them moving, right? And remember at that time they had lay preachers. So like if you were in New York, in a little rural area, you had a little congregational church you went to. Basically what happened was you had a lay preacher that was assigned to you. And that lay preacher would do most of the services, right? And then these other guys, these ordained guys, they would fly around like maybe once a month or so, or once every 8 weeks. And they would come in and they would serve the sacraments to you, right? Because they were the ones officially ordained to do that. And so that's kind of what he walked into when he came over here. But this brings up another point, and then I'll kind of stop. So one of the pivotal points in American history, and I don't want time to go through everything. You can go to the next one, was the Revolution. So the American Revolution, it provoked this crisis in the church, right? Because remember I told you that only ordained Anglican priests were authorized to give the sacraments. Well, when the Revolution popped up, most of the pastoral leadership fled because they were loyal to the crown and they had to go back home. And this kind of left a vacuum. And Wesley, you have to know, openly opposed the American Revolution. And it led to suspicion that American Methodist societies were loyal to the crown. And you can imagine how that went over. So after Britain acknowledged American independence, it was like 1782. About a year later in 1783, I think it was September of 1783, Wesley provided a sacramental ministry to the American societies by ordaining 2 lay preachers in England. And he consecrated Thomas Coke, that guy, as an Anglican priest to serve as what was known as a superintendent or a bishop in all of Canada and the United States. And he gave Coke the ability to ordain other people. And this was a major radical thing. This was a big no-no. First of all, Wesley had no authority to do that. And second of all, Coke had 0 authority to do what he was going to do. But they came over here anyway. And the reason why this is so significant is because there was a big conference, and most Methodists know this, it was called the Christmas Conference. It was in Baltimore in 1784. And this formally organized the church as a denomination. And this is important because see what happened is this movement that had started in these societies and these classes and these bands, and it was kind of a way of being Christian, right? But you still had ordained Anglican priests that you were tied to. Well, now all of a sudden they were sacramentally self-sufficient. You see what I mean? They didn't need the Anglican priesthood. They had their own. And it was at that moment in 1784 that we transitioned from a movement to a denomination, right? And we became self-sufficient as a church, and we became our own thing. And this didn't take place in Britain for a number of decades after. And that's why even British Methodists today, they don't claim us. They don't. There's a British Methodist church and there's an American Methodist church, right? Because it was a different trajectory over there. And Wesley did different things, right? So like in 1784, he revises the Book of Common Prayer, and he edits it a little bit, and he takes out some of that loyalist language and tweaks some things here and says, here you go, right? So he gives them their own Book of Common Prayer, kind of ish, right? And then he ordains these people. and there's other stuff going on, and he doesn't really define things doctrinally. He just, well, the Church of England has an Articles of Religion. We'll use that. You know what I mean? And he doesn't do anything in Britain because he knows that if he starts screwing around with the doctrines of the Anglican Church, it's just going to confuse people. You know what I mean? And he's less concerned. Wesley has always been like this. He was always like this. He is less concerned with the letter of the law than what you're doing right now. He sees the letter of the law and the sacraments and the doctrines of the church as the foundation upon which to build a life that serves God. And so he was way more concerned with that than he was sticking to the doctrines or trying to screw with the horizontal themes. But even throughout his life, it's funny, I read this wonderful little article, and I'll end with this, where that we've taken the good and the bad from Wesley, because people like to say, well, he was a rebel and he changed the rules. And he did a lot. Like whenever he butted up against something in America, he would just write a letter and he would change something, right? Yeah, you can do that, sure, go ahead. You know what I mean? It wasn't radical or anything, but he would change things in order to get things done, right? And so he had kind of this rebellious nature to him. And now see people in the 21st century, I think, in my opinion, we're sticking too much to that. And we think that part of our identity as Methodists is to be like this rebellious people. You know what I mean? And I'm like, no, you know, just
No.
you know, no, we're really not. You know what I mean? And this is where I'm going to leave it with y'all. I mean, I have a bunch of other slides that talk about the splits in American Methodism, and there were a lot of y'all. Like there was a lot of different branches of Methodism that split off. And of course, everybody knows on April 23rd of 1968 in Dallas, Texas, the EUB and the Methodist Church, the Methodist Episcopal Church, came together and formed the United Methodist Church. Right? And here's what I want you to take away from that. Is like as Methodists, we are grounded in a doctrinal identity, but we are not tied to one expression of that doctrine. We're broad enough to found ourselves on these statements, but we're ambiguous and fluid enough to understand multiple expressions of that faith that are lived out in the world. We're a church, but we're a movement. Does that make sense? It's like a milkshake, right? We're milk and ice cream. You know what I mean? Milk's the foundation, ice cream's just for fun. Yeah, you're pretty ice cream. You know what I mean? And we're kind of like that, if you will. And so we have to be careful with this, right? I think that even all of us in this room, right? There are probably some of you, like me, that grew up in very traditional environments. You know what I mean? You said the Apostles' Creed. You said a confessional statement. You read a psalm every Sunday. You followed the lectionary for 3 years at a time, right? Those are all good and dandy things. But then there's some of us in this room that grew up in hands in the air like you just don't care. Let's sing one verse and one chord 15 times. And praise the Lord. You know what I mean? And you're like, that's okay. It's okay. It really is, right? We need to allow ourselves, this is where I tell people all the time, we need to allow ourselves to be rooted in what we need to be rooted in. And then we need to be expressive enough to be adaptable to the time we find ourselves in. Right? And we need to hold that ground. And that is always going to be a tension. And I can guarantee you that as we move through the next 4 to 5 years, 8 years, right, that these discussions are going to come up, right? And you know what? I'm not concerned about where people land, and I don't want you to be either. I'm more concerned with how you treat each other. I'm more concerned with, I'm more concerned with how we do it. I really don't care where you land. I mean, look, I tell people all the time. 8 years ago, I was on the other side of the fence. The side of the WCA. On the sexuality thing, particularly. I was on that side, right? I didn't think that it was coherent. And then even when Bishop Alavito took her post 8 years ago, I got mad. I did. And I was vocal to people about it. But you know what's funny? I wasn't mad because she was LGBTQ. You know what I was mad about? Because they broke the rules. It says right there, right, in that book, that self-proclaiming LGBTQ people cannot be ordained. So first of all, how did she get ordained? And second of all, how in the world did she become a bishop of one of the biggest jurisdictions in the United States of America? The biggest jurisdiction. actually. And I was mad, and I was angry, right? But then I met some LGBTQ folks in seminary, and I got to know them, and I befriended them, and I watched them. And these were some of the most loving, pious, devout, loyal people, some of the smartest people I have ever met in my life. Young people. And it caused just enough dissonance in my mind to say maybe I can be grounded in my doctrinal identity while at the same time loving people and allowing them to be what they are. And that's not going to tear this down. Right? And you know what? When I got ordained in June, guess who put their hands on me? That very woman that I was railing against 8 years earlier. Put her hands on mine and said the words verbatim from the Book of Discipline and made me an elder in the ministry. And I wept. I wept for her and I wept for myself because I couldn't believe it. Right? And so I leave that with you to say, as we go into this split, don't presume. Let people be what they want to be. If they want to be traditionalists, let them be traditionalists. There's nothing wrong with that. If they want to be a little more liberal, let them be liberal. Because we say it all the time at St. Andrew, can we not think differently, but love alike? So I'm more concerned with how we're doing this. I'm not really worried about the state of the church or the existence of the church. It's been around for a long time, and it will be here after everyone in this room is dead. Right? The church will be fine because it doesn't belong. It belongs to God, first and foremost. Right? Cool. All right. Well, that's it. I had like 20 more slides, but Steve is flagging me down.
I would like to say something. Cindy Bates, that I don't know where she is now, or if anybody.
I think she's
remembers.
retired, actually. Yeah,
She is.
she's retired, actually.
And
Yeah, I met her.
she took the whole class into the sanctuary, and we all sat quietly, and she asked us, how does it feel when you see the baptismal bowl here, you see the pulpit here, you see the cross, and the order of worship is the same every week. It gives us a sense of comfort.
Sure.
To have that tradition, to have that order, and that might be my English ancestry, but I love the tradition and the order of worship that I'm familiar with. If I go to a different church where everything is totally different, I just feel so uncomfortable that I gotta come back to what.
That's natural. That's a very human thing. So this is what I learned last week in the Islam class. So within Islam, this is kind of the same way in the Orthodox Church. There are two parts of Sharia law. One section of Sharia law, it governs worship and prayer and all of that religious stuff. The second part of Sharia governs social life, right? So there's two general rules. In the first section that governs worship, the general rule is if it's not permitted, it is forbidden. Period. So if it is not expressly permitted in the language, it cannot be done. There's no room for doubt. Now the social side is flipped. If it's not forbidden, maybe it's permissible. You know what I mean? You see how it flips a little bit? And the jurors in Islamic law, they have a scale that they work on. So in social life, they have this scale. And it's like really a bad idea, sort of a bad idea. I don't care what you do. Kind of a good idea. You definitely need to do this. And so every social aspect of Sharia that comes down to a juror, that's how they grade it, right? And then those things become case law and it's jurisdictional law. As far as jurisprudence, I'm sorry. But anyway, but yeah, I think what you said, there's a lot of wisdom to that, right? Because for Muslims, that law, right, if it's not permitted, it's forbidden. That is the reason why you can walk into any mosque in this country or over there, and you will see the same exact thing happening that's been happening since the 7th century. And the same thing in an Orthodox church. If you walk into a Greek Orthodox church, the words, the liturgy, the order, everything that is done is the exact same way it's been done since the 5th century. It has not changed. Not one tittle, not one move has been changed. And that creates a sense of stability, and it does. Yeah. But at the same time, see, I'll push back.
Sanctuary, you know what to expect.
Yeah, it does. See, at the same time, I'll push back and I'll say to all of you to consider this. Sometimes that kind of rigidity can be stifling to the work of the Holy Spirit. Right? We can become so rigid that we don't let the flower of the Holy Spirit blossom and move us. And that's what Pentecostals would say, right? You know what I mean? That's what these kind of modern worshipers would say that like contemporary worship. That, you know, oh, yeah, it's fine. That's why we'll sing the same verse in the same chord 15 times, let the Holy Spirit. You know what I mean? And there's something beautiful about that. You know what I mean? So that's why these are the questions, right? Yeah. That, you know, you have to think about as you go in. And I always challenge people with this when you think about worship, is ask these questions. This is a really good question. Flesh these terms out. What has to happen for you individually and collectively to feel like you worshiped God that day? What has to be there? Physically and audibly, elementally, what has to be there? Some would say we need to sing. I would say we need to do Lord's Supper. If I had my way, we do communion or something. We do in the chapel, by the way. If you'd like, come at 8 o'clock. But anyway, a little quick ad. But we, you know, communion has to be there, right? Or I don't know, maybe preaching has to be there. There's a lot of debates now in worship circles and with liturgists like me that wonder if we need a sermon.
No.
There's one no, and other people are going, what? There has to be a sermon, right? You know what I mean?
We do need.
We do need a sermon. Okay, so yes, we do, right? But you see what I mean? Like, you know, that's what I mean. And then start asking yourself, like, why do I feel this way? Like, what? Where is that coming from? Is this something I grew up with? Is this something traditionally within my denomination? Is it a good or is it a bad thing, or do you even want to use those words? You know what I mean? You start like peeling back those layers to kind of figure out where all that's coming from, right?
What
I love,
Carol?
I love ritual. I hope it never goes away.
Well, as
I
long as
love
I'm here,
ritual. I can calm myself for God. There's because we live in such a high-tech, busy, crazy world. And there's a lot of confusion out there.
Yeah.
I grew up in the Methodist church. All the way through. I was married in the church. I'm Methodist through and through. But I love the ritual. I hope it never goes away. The baptism, everything about it. So, and that makes me feel closer to God. Because
That's
it
really
opens
what we
up,
want. You know?
it opens up spirituality. We live in a non-spiritual, you know, there's so many non-spiritual things going on. And it brings you back to spirituality.
Yeah.
And acceptance.
Yeah, the liturgies can certainly do that. Go by yourself.
What a great topic, Carol. Thank you. Stay after anybody and ask Jerry questions. We have to go. Some folks have to move on. But thank you, Jerry, for a wonderful presentation. Jerry, would you do a quick prayer?
Yeah. Actually, I had one. I was going to show you here.
What was this in a quick prayer?
Yeah. I'll say it quickly. Holy and loving God, we are grateful. We are grateful for this time together. We are grateful for cool weather and fall colors. We are grateful for you, your presence, and the gift of your Son, Christ. As we leave this room, may each of us go empowered by the Spirit to serve and love others, to show compassion to all and preach the gospel to all whom you bring across our path. In the strong name of Christ we pray, and all God's people said.
Amen. Thank you, everybody.